My name's Lindsey Hilsum. I'm the international editor of Channel 4 News. I've been spending a bit of time in Ukraine in the last 2 years. I first went there in 2014. Yaroslav Trofimov, who we have here, who is the author of this amazing book, has spent a lot longer in Ukraine. And that's partly because he was born there. And before I start asking him questions, let me just tell you a little bit about Yaroslav. He is chief foreign correspondent for the Wall Street Journal. I think we first met in Afghanistan. He was also in Iraq, in many different places in different conflicts. But the other thing I want to tell you is that in Ukraine, I found Yaroslav incredibly irritating. And the reason I found him irritating is because I would wake up in the morning wherever I was, and I would look at the Wall Street Journal, and I'd go, how the hell did he get there? Everybody knows you can't get there. Everybody knows that there's a roadblock which you can't get through. Everybody knows that they're not letting you through. And so I'd message him and say, how did you get to that village east of Kharkiv, which is not even supposed to have fallen to Ukrainian forces yet? And he said, oh, well, me and Manu, we just chatted to the soldiers on the roadblock and we managed to get through. So he always, 2, 3, 4 days ahead of the rest of us. But despite my resentment of the fact that he scooped me consistently, it is a great honour to have Yaroslav here. And also, Manu Brother, where is Manu? There. And are the pictures going round?
Yeah.
On the loop, yes. So, Manu is Yaroslav's partner in crime through this war. And so at some point we'll get Manu to tell us a bit about the pictures. But let me start with something which you don't actually talk about in the book. So you've covered all of these wars, and then now you have to go and cover a war in a country which was your own country, where you were born. How did, apart from scooping the rest of us, how different did that feel?
Well, thank you so much for this very generous introduction. And I mean, Ukraine is was my country, it still is my country. And however, I left Ukraine in 1990, and most of my career as a journalist was spent covering other people's wars. And since 9/11, it was pretty much wars all the time. First Afghanistan, then Iraq, then Afghanistan again, and various other conflicts, Somalia, Liberia, you name it. And the war in Georgia in 2008 when Russia invaded. And I remember after the first year in Iraq in 2004, which was a terrible year, many friends were killed or kidnapped. There were, they blew up the UN, they blew up the Red Cross, and in Ukraine, in the meantime, there was a revolution, a peaceful revolution. And I remember coming to Kiev the first time to cover Ukraine after leaving it, and it was remarkable. Not a single window had been broken, not a single person was injured, and political change on a massive scale was achieved peacefully. And I felt very proud about Ukraine at the time, about the nature of Ukrainians. But then was a conflict between one group of Ukrainians and another group of Ukrainians.
Yeah.
And then came the war in 2014. I remember being in Kabul at the time.
Do come in, and there are seats on the far right, so scamper across like mice and you will be accommodated. Yeah. Okay, we'll get Yara to speak closer.
All right.
I have a broadcast voice.
I'll be louder. Right, does it work?
I think it works, but yeah, if you...
Right. And so, and then it was 2014, and there was a war not between two groups of Ukrainians, it was an invasion by Russia, overt or covert, but bloody, and 14,000 people died in a several months in a war in Donbass, a war that was largely ignored by Western governments. Certainly nobody helped Ukraine at the time. And fast forward to August 2021, we were both in Kabul.
Yep.
And I remember how in the evening, President Ashraf Ghani inspected the troops around the city and said, we will fight, we will not surrender. And by lunchtime, he was in a helicopter heading to Abu Dhabi, and the Taliban were working past the Serena Hotel.
Yeah.
And a few days later, or 2 weeks later, once the American military withdrew, the Taliban were driving around in Humvees and MRAPs and even flying Black Hawks. And I remember being in Kiev ahead of the invasion, and this fear was in the back of my mind. What if President Zelensky would do the same? What if he would pull a gun? And I think it was not just me fearing that. I think a lot of Western governments, having seen how all this equipment had gone to Taliban hands, were reluctant to help Ukraine because the consensus was that what's the point, in 3 days it will fall and all these weapons will be in Russian hands. And that personal experience really colored everything. And obviously President Zelensky did not escape. He stayed. He said he will fight on, and the rest of the country did as well. And many of the experiences of other wars kind of didn't apply.
So it was different. So the whole, and how much, when we look at the success of the initial part of the Ukraine's resistance, how much of that do you think is because of Zelensky's refusal to leave? How important was that at the beginning?
I think it was very important, so at the time there were three of us. There was me, Manu, and Stivo, who was the head of risk for the Wall Street Journal. And the three of us were sort of driving around Ukraine. And I remember we were coming back to Kiev after spending the night just outside. The night after Zelensky made his first appearance, saying, "We are all here, we are staying, we're not going anywhere." And there were hundreds, maybe thousands of people coming out of neighborhood buildings, lining up to just get weapons and fight. And I think it really inspired them. But I think also the society itself was ready. And what really struck me in Ukraine is just how everyone insisted on maintaining order and kind of behaving as if to prove that Ukrainians have retained their dignity. The first lesson here in the war is that everybody wants dollars. So Steve and I, the night before the invasion, went and changed all our hryvnias into dollars. And then when the war began, we went to the supermarket to shop. And we kind of ran out of tinned food, but had lots of lobsters and pineapple still. And so we came laden with all these goods to the checkout counter and offer our dollars. And the lady there says, "We don't know what the exchange rate is. We don't want to cheat you. Can you pay with Apple Pay?"
Yeah.
And that was really encapsulating sort of, the dignity of how the Ukrainians treated this war.
No, I think that's right. There's another thing which you wrote here, which I think is rather lovely. You said, when you talk about how it felt, you said, "It felt wrong to wear on the streets of my own hometown the vest and helmet that I had donned hundreds of times in Iraq, Afghanistan, and other war zones." So there's a sense that it felt, it must, how did that feel? It was all wrong to you somehow.
Well, I think it would be wrong for anyone, right? So imagine you grew up in a city, so every little bit of geography, every building, every coffee shop, every corner has memories. This is where you had your first kiss, or when you read this book, or when you went to see on a school trip. And all of a sudden, the city is empty, the cars are gone, the people are gone, there are thuds of artillery, and it's about to be violated. And I have been in cities like this as they fell. Kiev did not fall, but you had this sense of the Russians getting closer and closer, and it did feel to me, but I think to every Ukrainian, as a very personal insult. How dare they? Because Ukraine hadn't even done anything to provoke this.
Right.
I didn't,
Come across and go on this side. Yeah. It was totally unprovoked.
Exactly. And so, and I think that's also what motivated the Ukrainians to resist so hard, because there was this sense of personal insult added.
And were you surprised at that resistance in the early days when the tanks were coming down in columns from Chernihiv and so on? What were you expecting?
So I actually came back to Ukraine in January, about a month before the war. And so Steve and I did a little tour of the East to gauge the sentiment. And in many parts of Eastern Ukraine, in Kharkiv, in Donbass, in the Ukrainian parts of Donbass, Ukrainian-controlled parts of Donbass, there was a genuine pro-Russian feeling in 2013.
Yeah.
Because in 2013, Russia, to many people, was a land of opportunities, a less corrupt country compared to the Ukrainian government at the time, a country with higher salaries, and Zelensky himself at the time was living in Moscow, working for Russian state television. He actually, he He sort of hosted the Russian New Year's Day TV show on the main Russian state TV channel.
Right.
But then Russia invaded, and there was 8 years of Russian rule in Donetsk and Luhansk. And people saw what this Russian world actually means. It means that, you know, people lost their jobs, gangsters were ruining land, the economy collapsed, and more than half the population of the Russian-controlled Donbass fled to Ukraine, to the West, or to Russia. And so in Kharkiv, there was 100,000 refugees from Donetsk, and everyone in the Russian-speaking East saw what it means to be living under the Russians. And this 8 years of that vivid example really turned people off Russia. And what we found again and again is that people were very determined to fight against Russia, and no one really supported the Russian invasion.
But that feeling is very different from the physical ability to do it.
Right.
And I think that was, because I think that many of us, you know, had similarly talked to those people and spent time in the East and thought, no, nobody wants this. But that, to translate that into actually, you know, being King Canute and stopping the waves, that's quite different.
Well, there are two elements to this. I think, first of all, mistakes on the part of Putin and the rest of the Russian government, because Putin really drank his own Kool-Aid. He really believed that the Ukrainians and the Russians are the same people, and that the Ukrainians will not resist. And in fact, a lot of these units coming in were carrying parade uniforms. With them.
Can everybody hear Yarrow?
No.
No. Okay. In that case, you're going to hold this microphone. Let's do that. You hold the microphone.
All right.
And talk. And speak into it.
And so, can people hear me now?
Okay. Better.
All right.
Apologies. Yeah.
So a lot of the Russian units coming into Ukraine actually were carrying parade uniforms for them because they were not expecting resistance. And the size of the Russian armies arrayed against Ukraine, about 200,000 troops, were really not sufficient if you were expecting a fight. And in fact, it proved to be insufficient. On the other hand, I think the Russians underestimated, and everyone else underestimated, the strength of the Ukrainian army and the changes that happened there. Because though the West did not provide weapons, the West did provide training, and a lot of the sort of ways in which it operates changed. So the idea was this, that a small Soviet army would be fighting against a big Soviet army, and the outcome would be preordained. But in fact, it was not a small Soviet army. And it was sufficiently nimble, and the sort of the concept of mission command, under which decision-making is delegated, had taken root in it and allowed this initiative that really rescued the country at the time when communications were difficult and there was perhaps chaos in the capital.
So tell me a bit about, so you were in Kyiv in that early part, and so we'll sort of go through the war a little bit, because obviously there are particular moments that stand out, and one of the moments which really stands out, which people remember, is the holding back of the Russian forces at Hostomel, at the airport, and you went there.
Right, so...
that was a bit insane.
Well, we went there because we were told by Zelensky that it had been retaken by the Ukrainian forces.
And it turned out to not be quite like that.
Not quite like that, no. So we left the hotel at crack of dawn and drove there. And you know, Kyiv is a big city, and it takes a long time usually to get to Hostomel. But since there was no one anywhere, we just flew right through it without encountering any troops. And when we came to the bridge to Hostomel, all of a sudden there was a firefight, and the Ukrainian soldiers were shouting at us, "Get out of the way, because we're going to blow up the bridge." And as we drove back, we saw all these volunteers in their jeans, just trying to dig something, some sort of trench in the forest. So they obviously had no chance against Russian tanks, should Russian tanks get that far. So it was really a touch-and-go moment. And but the Ukrainian forces held out long enough in Hostomel to prevent the Russians from being able to land aircraft there, fixed-wing aircraft. So the Russian paratroopers landed there. They lost a bunch of helicopters, but they kept the airfield. But by then, the time was gained by the Ukrainian troops to bring in artillery, other units, to strafe the runway, and so all these transport planes that were supposed to carry a brigade or two of Russian paratroopers with their fighting vehicles never managed to land, and Kiev was saved that day.
So that was, so what are we, like a week into the war at this point?
No, this is day one.
It's absolutely day one, so that was absolutely critical.
Yes.
Absolutely critical. And then let me jump forward a bit, because obviously one of the other things that people remember is the horror of the Russian occupation of places like Irpin and also Bucha.
Right.
That was, I mean, everybody was shocked, but I suppose there's a difference between being shocked and surprised. Were you surprised at how appalling the atrocities were, as well as being shocked, or not really?
Not really, no. So, Kiev was more or less spared at the time. The Russians did not shell the center of Kiev at the time. But they did shell and fire missiles at the center of Kharkiv, the second largest city. And we went to Kharkiv about, I think, 10 days into the war. And having spent time there before the war, it was quite an apocalyptic sight, because the entire main street had been bombed, and the water had burst, and then all these icicles formed in the facades of buildings that were clinking in this icy wind, and there was no one there, and the entire residential areas north of Kharkiv were just being obliterated. Went to the hospital to talk to doctors, and showed out so these children had been injured, and very heartbreaking scenes of human suffering. And seeing what the Russians were doing in Kharkiv, which is supposedly populated by the Russian speakers that Putin was supposedly saving from oppression, there was no doubt that there would be no mercy.
They knew there'd be no mercy. You knew. But no mercy is different from torture and rape. Yes,
but Russia very successfully othered Ukrainians. To me, it was shocking. I was speaking to a colleague in Russia on the eve of the invasion and saying, okay, I understand all the atrocities they've committed in Chechnya, in Aleppo, but bombing, but he's saying that they're one people. How will the Russian people react to this wholesale murder of Ukrainians that's coming? And yet, the Russian propaganda was very successful, to a degree that again and again we would speak to families in Kharkiv and other cities who have relatives. There was a woman I spoke to, her father was in Russia, and she was calling him and saying, my apartment buildings were bombed, my neighbors were killed by the Russian military, and he would say, you're lying to me, must be the Nazis bombing you. Who are you going to trust, your own daughter or Russian television? In many cases it was Russian television.
I found that again, and I found it extraordinary, just sort of talking. You would talk to people, and particularly there were young people you were talking to, and it was their parents or their grandparents in Russia, and they'd be saying exactly that, but Mum, I can see what's happening in front of my very eyes. They just couldn't believe it. How is Russian propaganda so powerful?
I don't know. I kept wondering about that, because even in Donbass, cities like Bakhmut, you would still find some people who are staying there waiting for the Russians to come, a small minority, and would ask them, but the Russians shell, as long as you distinguish between you and your pro-Ukrainian neighbor when it slaps into your building. But I think the messaging has been so strong, and this cult of World War II that Putin really turned into a state religion. I mean, the national holiday in Russia is May 9th, and the victory in Europe Day for the Soviet Union. And he successfully managed to portray everything else as a second act of the Great Russian victory in World War II. And that's why so many people in Russia are willingly dying in this war. We're not seeing any protests, because entire generations have been raised on this idea of, well, our turn will come just like our forefathers to fight the Nazis, and there it is. And it's extraordinary.
But I think the most extraordinary thing is, you just sort of point out, is this sort of double thing, that on the one hand, the Ukrainians, we are at one with the Ukrainians, and on the other hand, the Ukrainians are less than nothing. It sort of doesn't make sense, and yet it's still very powerful.
Yeah, and the message has been changing, and I think the message now is much more genocidal. And if you see what Dmitry Medvedev was saying just this month, the former president and still the head of the ruling party, he said that any Ukrainian state is a mortal threat to any Ukrainian, no matter how friendly to Russia. Your choice is to become Russians or die, pretty much. It went from saying Ukrainians and Russians are brothers to saying Ukrainians don't exist, or shouldn't exist.
Extraordinary, isn't it? Tell me a little bit about, before we, in a minute I'm going to ask Manu to come up and give us a guide to some of these pictures that we're seeing. But tell me a bit about, who are some of the memorable characters that you met? Because your book is full of people as well. You know, you take us through the war, but it's people, isn't it? Who are the ones who you'll never forget?
Yeah, well, you know, despite having feelings and emotions, I really tried to, except for the passage you read, to keep them to myself mostly, and tell the story, sort of being sort of like a cinema verite camera, following the characters and the events. And we kept going back to some of the same people as they moved through the war. So one of them, for example, is a Ukrainian entrepreneur who was, one of the 100 most wealthiest people in Ukraine, who was skiing in Austria the day before the war began, abandoned everything, sort of went back to Kharkiv, and pretty much used his entire fortune to create a battalion that now became a brigade. And we went with him and basically on his first combat mission, not knowing that it was his first combat mission.
Oh, right.
We probably wouldn't have gone.
Yes. Sometimes it's better not to know these things.
Yes.
Yeah.
So there was some tank shells in proximity. And another character is a drone operator from Kiev who was a lawyer before the war, Flemish knight impersonator. He really liked Flemish knight tournaments. And then when the war started, he was one of the people defending central Kiev. And then his drone unit, first in Kherson and then in Bakhmut, proved instrumental in holding back and then defeating the Russians. Another character is one of the leaders of the defense of Mariupol, who was a tour operator in Phuket in Thailand. And again, so many people abandoned their civilian lives and dropped everything to come back and defend the country. It's remarkable. And so he came back in 2014 first, and then he stayed and became a major in the Ukrainian National Guard. And he was leading the defense of the northern approaches to Mariupol when it was besieged. Taken prisoner by the Russians when Azovstal surrendered. Survived Russian captivity when Ukrainian prisoners of war were killed in this POW camp in Novenivka, and then was traded back and is now back on the front line.
It's amazing. What did he tell you about life in the prison camp? Because it's hard to think of anything more horrendous, really, isn't it?
So the prisoner exchange happened in September 2022, and he was telling me that all they were broadcasting to them in prison were Russian propaganda news. And it was all about Russian victories and the imminent fall of Kiev. And then all of a sudden, the Ukrainian offensive in Kharkiv, which was a massive success, and a shock to the Russians. And the propagandists didn't know what to say. So suddenly, for half a day, there was chaos on Russian TV, and all the prisoners became really happy. And then they switched the channel, and there was music from now on.
Yes, well, it's always, when they start to play the martial music or Bob Marley, you know there's something happening.
Yeah, it was Russian pop. It was much more cool than that.
Okay, listen, let's stop for a minute. Manu, do you want to come up? Because I know these pictures are on a loop, and I think that they also tell the story. So I don't know if you want to take the microphone for a minute.
So Manu and I were together on all those reporting trips. I don't think there was a single one when we were separated.
Do you want to see the pictures?
Or I don't know, you go down, I mean, one of the two, you go down and just tell us, it'd just be useful to know, I mean, I can't see them obviously, but just to, you could just tell the audience a little bit about what they're seeing.
First of all, excuse me for destroying our language, right?
But tell us more about Manu first.
Yeah.
Oh,
Yes.
I'm the guy like here.
So Manu is a Pulitzer Prize winning photographer
From where?
from Spain.
Okay.
And our partner in crime.
Do you want to share this?
Do you need some help?
Is this working?
Yeah, it's working now, yeah.
Okay, right. Just let me get my laptop.
Yeah, so you know what this is.
Sorry, I'm not used to be also starring.
No, but we want to know because
So basically, that was at the very beginning, and they blew up the Ukrainians blew up the bridge from Irpin, so they could stop the Russian troops to enter Kiev, right? On that day, it was we went we did like a couple of trips together, but basically, I was taking the car in the morning and going by my own to see what was going on there, and late he was joining me, and one day that day we were together, and we were leaving, and basically they were shelling.
The Russians were
The
shouting.
Russians were shelling, and they left, and I was like, I'm gonna take 5 more minutes, guys, and then I found this scene, which basically was the proof, like they were targeting the only corridor for civilians to leave Irpin and Bucha.
So this was about a week into the war, and for the first time we actually witnessed how the Russian forces were deliberately shelling civilians trying to flee and killing them.
So yeah, I took 5 more minutes. It was probably 50, and yeah, I mean, it was. I think it's like that was like the day we all realized that no mercy. So we're talking
Yes.
about no
Mano was
mercy.
saying bastardos very loudly.
Yeah, Bastardos is the small word I use. I keep going.
Just do another couple, just so we get a bit of an idea.
Yeah.
Do 2 or
I'm
3
not gonna
more.
go like forever. So, anyway, this is like the day. This is the offensive in the north. It was the day like the Ukrainian army took the city of Liman, and we were just like trying to go a little bit farther, and we saw this man just crawling on the road with no legs, and basically what we did, we touched. This over there, the security guy that we're working with now. We went back to Irpin, we just called, we were talking with the Ukrainians, and we came back with the guys to help this guy. I remember we had the discussion, is a civilian or is an army? And when I sent the picture to Yaro, I told him, man, he's an army. So if you look at the arm of the guy, he's wearing 2 watches. Normally you do that when you loot.
When you're looting.
Yeah,
So let me just have it, so do you want to give the microphone just back to, because this is one of the, to me this is one of the most arresting stories in the book. It's basically you come across a wounded Russian soldier, and that's the dilemma. What the hell do you do? So what the hell did you do?
Right. Well, first of all, Hatch is not just a security guy, as I'm sure Mano was going to say. He was partner extraordinaire in much of the reporting, and without him, much of this would not be possible, including this. But so this was in Le Mans. We drove into Le Mans the morning it fell in October 2022. I think we're the first to come into the city.
You were. I was 2 days behind.
And so we followed Ukrainian special forces as they just came in and they ambushed Russian convoy first. So we drove past this convoy, sort of all this freshly killed soldiers still lying on the road, which was hard to see because we've seen lots of dead Russian soldiers until then, but they were mostly long dead.
Yeah. So this is quite unpleasant.
Well, you know, like bloated corpses sort of by the roadside, as gruesome as they are, they don't look human. But these soldiers had just been killed, and so they had a sort of freshness of life in them.
Everybody, they're all some mother's son.
Exactly, and I kept thinking, you know, there was a guy there, and I kept thinking, you know, his wife or spouse or mother must be right now trying to call him, and his phone is not answering. And so we drove past that, and we're trying to go to the other side of Le Mans. And it wasn't clear if the Russians were still there or not. And we saw this several trucks that were burning on the roadside, the Russian armored vehicles. And as we kept going, suddenly saw a man crawling on the road, and he was missing his foot. And so we had this dilemma: do we stop or do we not? And then I see there's a hand grenade right next to him. And so we decided not to stop because who knows. And so we went right back, and there were 2 Ukrainian soldiers about 5 minutes drive away. So then they came out with us, and they picked up the man who did not use the grenade. And he kept saying he's from Belarus, and he's not really a soldier, but maybe he was a soldier. And they took him for medical care. And it's only later, when we were preparing the photos for the book, and many of these photos are in the book, that we realized he was wearing 2 watches, which is what looters usually do. So he was probably someone trying to loot the bodies of soldiers that were there.
Amazing. So by the time you go to Liman, so this is a point of great hope for the Ukrainians, right? So there's this. So you start off with the Russians coming in, they get pushed back and held, and then we're sort of stuck for a bit. And then there's this moment of great hope, which I think all of us who were there remember. So, and Liman was this was east of Kharkiv, when the Ukrainians took quite a lot of territory which the Russians had taken. Well, tell me a bit more about covering that, and what was that like, and what you remember of it, and what the morale was like amongst the Ukrainian soldiers then.
Well, I think the morale was sky high, because after being on the defensive for month and month, and fighting for one little village for many more months, suddenly they were, taking dozens of villages and towns every day. This was also the moment where Putin really put the nuclear card on the table in a big way, because around the same time he announced the so-called annexation of 4 Ukrainian regions, none of which he controlled in full, in fact, and still doesn't, and said, this is now Russian territory, any advance will be met with all means available, quote unquote, I am not bluffing. And that was taken with utmost seriousness in Washington and other capitals, and that was the moment where diplomacy kind of was at the at its most intense. But also it meant that the support for Ukrainian forces was throttled, because even though Ukraine called his bluff and kept going forward, and in fact took Liman and Kherson after the annexation, it just the offensive ran out of steam because there just wasn't enough gear, there wasn't enough ammunition.
So that was when they really needed the Western.
Exactly, and that was a moment of historic opportunity, because at the time Russia only had about 100,000 combat troops in Ukraine. Putin was refusing to mobilize more troops because doing so would have meant acknowledging that the special military operation, quote unquote, is not going to plan. And Ukraine had an advantage in manpower, it did not have an advantage in ammunition. The US and allies would give Ukraine everything it was asking for at the time: tanks, Bradleys, Strikers, Patriot air defenses. A year later, but by then Russia had mobilized.
So do you think that they've never given the F-16s, they've never given the air cover, but do you think that if they had given, the long-range artillery and so on that they asked for at that time, that could have made a decisive difference?
It would certainly have made a difference, and it would have been the biggest chance for Ukraine to retake.
So that was the moment that they had?
That was the moment, because the Russian trenches were empty. They only had about 100,000 troops on the entire front line of thousands of miles.
But then of course, with the big counter-offensive that gave the Russians, they had time to...
Yeah, because Russia had then almost a year to dig trenches, to recruit personnel, lay minefields, and Ukraine also had lost a great deal of manpower in the meantime in the Battle of Bakhmut.
Yeah, so the Battle of, in a minute we're going to come on to what's going on today, and then I'm going to throw it open, but I am fascinated by the Battle of Bakhmut, because to me it seems so pointless. It seems so pointless just to keep slugging away and losing men in Bakhmut for this shitty place. Am I wrong? Was it worth fighting for?
I think there are different opinions about that. At the time, a lot of commanders in Bakhmut and on the front lines were saying exactly what you said, that it's pointless, we should retreat. And there was a great fear that just like in 2014, Ukrainian units would be surrounded, taken prisoner, and there would be a debacle. That didn't happen. What happened in Bakhmut is that Wagner, which was the only Russian force fighting there, and the only Russian force capable of offensive operations, since basically April 2022, was destroyed.
Yeah.
According to Prigozhin, Wagner's had some 30,000 troops of Wagner were killed in battle. And Wagner's losses there directly led to the uprising that for a moment threatened to topple the regime in Russia, and then to the disintegration of Wagner as an effective fighting force. So Ukraine's most powerful and most capable enemy in the battlefield no longer exists. So that is also the achievement of Bakhmut.
That's true. So you knew President Zelensky before the war, and then you've seen him, I mean, at least once, I think more than once, during the war. Tell us a bit about how he's changed, how you've perceived him changing.
Well, I mean, he is a different man, obviously. He has the weight of history on his shoulders, the weight of responsibility, and that he was not necessarily prepared for before the war came. You know, when I saw him a couple of years before the war, he was still preoccupied with President Trump's refusal to meet him.
Yeah.
So he was at the dinner in Kiev. He was on stage with an actor who was playing Zelensky, and he was playing himself, talking to an actor playing Zelensky. And he was being asked, you know, so what about your meeting with President Trump? And he pointed to the audience, and the actress was playing President Underwood in show Game of Cards. Sorry.
In which one?
President Carrie Underwood.
President Carrie Underwood, that's, help me, I can't.
House of Cards, there,
House of
in a
Cards,
House of
that's it,
Cards.
yes.
So she was there, and I said, well, you should ask the real president. And it was all jolly and funny, and he really liked basking in sort of love and popularity. I think when he spent several months underground in the presidential office in Kiev, and he was confronted with the grim reality of war, that did change him.
Yes.
And he kept talking about civilian casualties. He kept talking about, you know, how many people are unaccounted for after they're just vaporized in strikes and buildings.
Yeah.
And, you know, he kept sort of pulling out his phone and showing the daily reports of how many soldiers were killed. So I think...
so where you could feel how the deaths of Ukrainians were weighing on him.
Absolutely, yes, yes. And, you know, it's a tough job running a country during a war, especially this kind of war.
And we've seen, and we sort of, to bring us up to date, before I open out to questions, I mean, this book ends at quite a sort of optimistic moment, but what we've seen in the last few days is this split between Zelensky and the head of the army, Zaluzhny. Now, I think we've all been aware of that for quite some time, but it's sort of broken out into the open this week. Tell us what you make of that.
Well, there has been tension between the two of them all along.
Hold your microphone closer.
This is not new.
It's not new, the tension between them.
Yes, and obviously Zaluzhny is very popular in Ukraine, and especially within the armed forces. And whenever you go in towns that had been liberated by the Ukrainian army, soldiers would stencil portraits of Zaluzhny on the wall, not Zelensky.
Right.
Having said that, nobody questions the legitimacy of Zelensky, and he has the right, constitutionally, to remove Zaluzhny. I think this rivalry so far has been contained, and we'll see if it gets contained in the future. But there's certainly a lot of pressure from the society and from Ukraine's foreign partners to not let this.
But why would he? I mean, is there, other than rivalry, is there a reason to remove Zaluzhny? Because obviously we see the war at the moment not going as well as it was.
Right.
And Zaluzhny said it was at a stalemate, and he got 10 tons of shit on his head for saying that, because it's a banned word, stalemate. He's actually right, he was telling the truth.
Of course.
Is there a reason to get rid of, is there any good military reason to get rid of Zaluzhny, or is this just, you know, political infighting?
Well, if there is one, it has not been articulated by anyone.
Right.
And that's probably why the decision has not been made.
Yeah. And the Americans, presumably, don't want Zaluzhny to go.
Well, there's also a question of who will replace him. So, the commander of land forces, General Syrsky, is not very popular within the military. And he's blamed by some of the tactics that led to large loss of life. The other candidate, General Budanov, who is the head of the military intelligence, is young and is also distrusted by some for very risky tactics and operations. And so, within the military, there's no denial that Zaluzhny is extremely popular.
Right.
And within society as well. And so again, there must be a good reason to remove him. If he's removed, that's what many people say anyway.
So we're at a moment of great peril, really, then. We're at a moment of great peril militarily, and we're at a moment of great peril politically as well.
Well, there is a moment of great peril, not because of Zaluzhny and Zelensky. There is a moment of great peril because US aid, which is indispensable, has dried up. Congress has not passed the defense supplemental, and it looks increasingly less likely it will, because aid to Ukraine is becoming entangled in the most intractable domestic political issue in the US, border security,
Yeah.
and we have an election coming up. And so, and that already has an effect in the battlefield. Ukraine is already running out of ammunition. If there was parity a few months ago, now Russia has maybe 5 to 10 times advantage in the number of shells it can fire. And over time, the situation will be determined not just by the battlefield, but also by internal cohesion and sort of resilience of the society. And
Yeah.
there again, Ukraine is dependent on foreign aid. There is no escaping. It doesn't have much of an economy because it's under attack.
And we have a EU meeting tomorrow,
Correct.
where Hungary is quite likely to veto the next tranche of EU aid.
Well, I think the other members of the EU say they will find ways to circumvent that.
Yeah.
But it's all getting more and more complicated. And it's also really sending a signal to Putin that his strategy of outweighting and outlasting the Western will to help Ukraine will work.
And particularly since we know that Putin is waiting for the election when Donald Trump is going to solve it all in 24 hours.
Well, so it appears. Certainly Russian television is very gung-ho on Trump coming.
And what is Russian television saying?
Well, our friend Donald Trump, that's what they say.
Our friend Donald Trump. Well, that's all you need to know. Let me throw this open, because I'm sure that there are many questions. So anybody, otherwise I'll just grab it on. Any more questions? TV's Lee's Descent.
Thank you so much, here, Lindsey and Yarrow. How would you assess the morale now? I know it's very hard to speak of a nation, but I think all of us who've been totally impressed by the resilience, the kind of stoicism that you've been talking about. At the end of the day, Ukrainians are only human and they must be wanting to get back to their lives. Do you think we're reaching a point where the public mood has changed? Before it used to be no concessions, we will fight to the end and we will win. Do you sense it's starting to change?
So I think there's a lot less optimism now. Nobody's talking about, beach party in Crimea next summer. But the basics haven't changed. The war was and is existential. What Russia seeks and says it seeks is the elimination of not just the government, but of Ukraine as a state, as a nation, as a culture. They must become Russians or die, as Medvedev has said. And that doesn't leave you many options. You may be upset, you may be tired, you may be demoralized, but if it's a war to survive, what else can you do except keep fighting it? And I think there is this sort of grim determination to keep going, because there is no prospect of peace talks anytime soon. And in any case, if Russia wants everything, how can you talk about peace?
What about the idea that, it's certainly talked about in Western capitals, that basically the Karelia solution, Finland gave up a tenth of its territory to the Russians in World War II and then went on to become one of the most prosperous countries in the world, absorbed into European apparatus and so on?
Well, first of all, if you look at it from the technically a Russian legal standpoint, Russia annexed 4 regions.
Yeah.
It doesn't control any of them in full, so under Russian law, all the fighting is technically on occupied Russian territory. Mm-hmm. So it's impossible for Putin to settle on the current lines without at least conquering Zaporizhia and Kherson, and the half of Donetsk that he doesn't control. So a priori, freezing the conflict is not just not acceptable for Ukraine, but also would be very, very difficult politically for the Russian government. And Finland didn't just lose territory; it did lose political independence.
Well, it
in
became
many ways.
neutral until it joined NATO.
Well, it became
It's not
neutral, but so the Soviet Union had veto over key policies in Finland
Yeah,
until the collapse of the Soviet Union for generations.
yeah.
And if you Finlandization may sound nice, but if you talk to actual Finns, they have really bad memories about that.
Yeah, there's all point. Yes, a gentleman in the front there.
Stephen Deal, lifelong Russia watcher and ex-BBC colleague of Lindsey's. As you ended the first part, you were on a rather down note, pointing out that with Western help not coming in as we had hoped, as it had been. Can I turn it the other way around and say also that at the same time, the war is damaging Russia's economy. The war is becoming more felt by Russians who up until now have been able to largely ignore it, particularly in big cities. Russian society is becoming ever more violent. It was violent enough, but now you've got soldiers going back who are even more violent than they were. You've got former prisoners. I don't want to get, I'm not saying you gave this impression, but I think there are certain cracks appearing in Russian society, which may also have an effect the other way and actually work in Ukraine's favour. What would you say to that?
Well, as they like to say blandly, Russia is hard but brittle. And so there are certainly many cracks in the Russian society, and we don't necessarily see all of them. I mean, not many people predicted the Prigozhin uprising, for example. So we don't know what else can be sort of festering under the surface there. And that goes back to the point I made, that over time, this war will be decided by which society is more resilient, which one will crack first from within. And that could be Russia, could be Ukraine. And whether it's Russia or Ukraine does depend on Western aid.
So you see, does it depend? I mean, it depends on Western aid, but what I was reading something today about the IMF is saying that the Russian economy is going to grow by 2.6% this year because they found ways round the oil sanctions. Basically, the oil goes to India and then gets laundered and comes back to Europe pretending to be something else. So in a sense, the Western pressure on Russia doesn't seem to have had the impact that they had hoped.
Well, it has some impact. It doesn't have enough impact, and also in terms of technology. When the Russian missiles that were freshly produced get examined after the malfunction in Ukraine, chips and components made in the West are chock-a-block in there.
Right.
So Russia is also quite able to circumvent the technological sanctions. And obviously now that they are more and more allied with Iran, they have great teachers in how to do that for a long time.
Yeah. Yes, there was a question over there. Yes, sir.
Hi, just a Ukraine watcher. Does Ukraine fatigue also mean an end of questioning some of Ukraine's problems, so the corruption? Do we have to avert our eyes from various things? You've mentioned it, but can Zelensky last another year? And if so, is it better if he leaves now?
Well, I think it's not something for outsiders to decide. It's for the Ukrainian people, and there is no mechanism for Zelensky to leave office as long as the war is on. Constitutionally,
Well, what is the because I'm slightly confused on this because elections are scheduled for March, but under martial law there are no elections. Is that right?
Correct.
Yeah. Okay.
And obviously, Ukrainian officials would cite the example of this country,
Yes.
which also didn't have elections until the war in Europe ended. And
Right. Well,
Parliament kept
but we
prolonging-
didn't change prime minister in the middle of the war, did we?
But not, it's a different system.
Yes,
Parliament
it
elects the
is,
prime
yeah.
minister, but there was the same parliament sitting well past
Yeah.
its mandate.
Fair, yeah,
It's
okay.
initially expired.
But the corruption point is an interesting one.
I think, if you're asking me whether the world should avert its eyes on corruption, no, of course not. I think Ukrainians and Ukrainian media were instrumental in uncovering a lot of the corruption recently. The defense minister had to resign after corruption allegations or instances of corruption in procurement were made public by Ukrainian media. When the Ministry of Defense was buying eggs at 3 times the price that the Ministry of Interior was paying for them.
Will that help, for instance, the German support or the American government? Will it make Ukraine more interesting if we can answer some of these questions?
More interesting.
Well, are you saying that, I mean, I think maybe that's what,
less fatiguing.
less fatiguing. I mean, is it the question that when you see them doing something about corruption, does it make the West want to support them more because they're doing something about corruption? Or does it make the West want to support them less because they're so corrupt? I mean, it's kind of like, can you win?
Yeah, I think, it's primarily Ukrainians uncovering corruption in Ukraine.
It is.
Because the war is existential, but also, every war breeds corruption, breeds Kashmir too. And so, but a lot of Ukrainians understand how dangerous this corruption is, which is why it gets uncovered, which is why people get punished
Yes.
and go to prison, which is, why all the military recruitment office heads across Ukraine have been fired. And there's no hiding that. But I think also what is true is that the talk of corruption in Ukraine often gets weaponized against Ukraine.
Yeah.
And sometimes Ukrainians are disinclined to accept these lectures when you look at Europe, and you have the former Chancellor of Germany, the former Foreign Minister of Austria, former leading candidate in France, all actually being on Russian payroll.
Yep.
And so, how much more corrupt can you get?
Lady in the second row here.
Yes, last summer I worked with 8 Ukrainian directors on their screenplays, online of course, and one of them was proposing a film after the war, saying that still the corruption would be so endemic that really the wives and the daughters, who had been in Europe would not be coming back. And I said, but who are these very corrupt people? And he said, Zelensky's head of his office.
Yeah.
The man who had, previous to the war, he'd been a producer.
Yeah, Andrei Yermak. He's a very powerful man, yes.
Right.
Yeah.
And when I asked for the name again, even the woman in the Film Academy just typed it into the chat line. I mean, she, it was really interesting to have, two quite
So basically the point being that they were very concerned about corruption close to Zelensky.
Zelensky's office, so I mean...
There is some dispute, but go on.
Yeah, I mean, it's part of parcel of Ukrainian politics that people accuse each other of corruption. Obviously, Zelensky himself came to power as a candidate against corruption of all the previous political parties. And once you're in power, you're in turn subjected to the same attention. And I'm sure we all know there had been instances of corruption in this government, like any other government in Ukraine. And that's something the Ukrainian society will have to deal with after the war and during the war.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the interesting things is trying to deal with it during the war,
Exactly.
as opposed to
And
after.
that's complicated because war requires secrecy, so you cannot be transparent about your procurement orders.
It requires secrecy. It requires vast amounts of money.
Yes.
That's a disastrous combination. Alan, yes. Yeah.
There was a very large number of Ukrainians who left the country, settled in Europe, about 1 million, I think. Do you think that they will return? What's the incentive for them to return, given the fact that this war is probably going to be continuing, or at least stalemated?
I think at the peak of it, about 7 million Ukrainians had left the country. And a great many of them did come back. People from Kiev, people from Western Ukraine, largely returned back to Ukraine, 2-3 months into the war. It's a very interesting demographic because it's very unlike the other refugee populations because it's mostly women, children, and the elderly. Because men up to the age of 60 cannot leave Ukraine normally. And so there is a great incentive for them to come back because they still have the rest of the families back home. And I think a great many of them will come back if there is something to come back to. That's certainly a message I keep hearing.
Yeah, and the gentleman at the back. Yes, you.
I'm interested in the role that Poroshenko is playing, so not just sort of blackening of Zelensky's name or sort of making out he's responsible for all the mistakes in the country. It seems to be kind of perhaps linked to people around him, perhaps. I don't know what you think.
Yes, so this is Poroshenko, who was the previous Prime Minister before before Zelensky. Yeah, and who's just been barred from leaving the country. I see. What role does he play?
What is it all about?
So I keep running into Poroshenko in various conferences in
Yes.
like
He puts
Halifax
himself
and
about a
Munich.
bit, doesn't he?
Yeah, he does travel a lot. And the book actually starts with me seeing Poroshenko on the eve of the invasion, where he delivers this lecture on how unity is paramount in the face of the enemy, and how Ukraine had lost its independence in the past so many times because of political fighting, which is a very correct analysis if you look back at Ukrainian history. So Poroshenko, and then he sort of leans towards me and says, you know, war is starting tomorrow, by the way. If you want to get out of the country, now it's your last moment. And he was off by about an hour. He has not publicly criticized Zelensky so far. What people around him say, well, you know, again, there are politics in Ukraine. They are hidden right now from sight, sort of happening underground. But it's been 2 years, and you know, you cannot forever ban politics. If there will be an election one day, you know, I'm sure Poroshenko will run.
Do you think Poroshenko would have stayed in Kyiv? If he'd been president, would he have stayed in Kyiv, or would he have taken the ride?
I don't know.
I just often thought about it.
Well, he did stay in Kiev.
Yeah.
You know, he did not go to Lviv.
True. True, very
From the
true.
beginning, you know, he was posing with, you know, his Kalashnikov.
Okay, yes, there's a hand here, yes.
If you excuse the phrasing of the question, what is the Americans' problem? What the hell is the problem?
What's the Americans' problem? What a good question.
They had this opportunity, as you say, that they lost to not give all the weapons out to Kharkiv. Was the nuclear threat enough?
Well, there are many names for it. I mean, the good name is escalation management, and the bad name is self-containment and tying yourself in self-imposed red lines. But one way or another, Russian nuclear blackmail worked. It didn't work to completely stop Western aid, American aid, but it certainly worked to throttle it and to make sure it arrives too late, too little very often, and some of the capabilities still haven't arrived, again, because of fear of what will Russia do. And you know, the Ukrainian response to that is Russia hasn't done anything it could do except for the nukes.
I mean, also on the Europeans with the ammunition. I mean, the Europeans promised all sorts of ammunition that they still haven't made, is that right? I mean,
Yeah, I mean, there are lots of promises, but Europe and the US have this de-industrialized in the past
yes.
decades, so there's just no capacity to make all this stuff.
Yeah.
And it's remarkable that North Korea was able to supply about 1 million shells, artillery shells, to Russia, which is about 3 times what the European Union was able to in a year.
Yeah.
And you know, increasing this capacity requires sometimes painful decisions. You know, there are ecological regulations, you know, people don't want to have explosives factories in the backyard. And it's very hard to do so if you continue normal course of affairs. You don't have any emergent, and nobody wanted to expend any political capital on taking these unpopular decisions.
No, that's right. We had, I think he was a former chief of staff telling us the other day here that it was about time we all started training and joining the army because the Russians were going to come here. I don't think that went down very well as a general message. I think we're kind of done on the questions. So, let me say, I'm just going to tell you another thing, which is that Yarrow has written another book. I mean, how can somebody write 2 books at the same time? It's sort of... Just tell us a little bit about this book.
So this book was started in 2014. I was stuck in Kabul and couldn't go cover the war in Ukraine, a very misunderstood country, and it was finished in January 2021, so just before the invasion began.
And it's a novel.
It's a novel. It's a novel that is set in Ukraine when it was the deadliest place on earth between 1930 and 1953. So between the Holodomor famine, the Holocaust, the war, and the Soviet reprisals against anything Ukrainian. And there are scenes of war in Kiev, which were imaginary when I wrote it. And then all of a sudden, some of this month later, it became reality, which was very painful.
Yeah.
So anyways, this book is coming out in July.
And it's based on something with your grandmother?
It's based on many twists and turns of my grandmother's life.
Hmm.
And it's called No Country for Love.
No Country for Love. So when did you say it's coming out?
July.
In July. So
At
we'll
Little
look forward to
Brown.
that. So tell us, what are your plans? Are you going back to Ukraine in the next few weeks?
Not next 2 weeks, but next month probably, yes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, next month. Okay, great. So, ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for coming. You can buy Yaro's book there. You can also buy my